So without further ado, we're excited to welcome Alex Cadel as our guest speaker for today's webinar. Alex works for the province of Nova Scotia, supporting the delivery of climate services in Nova Scotia in partnership with Climate Atlantic. His work helps people access, understand, and use climate change information so that governments, organizations, and individuals can make informed decisions about how to respond and adapt. He holds a Master of Climate Change from the University of Waterloo and a BSc in Environmental Sciences from the University of Guelph. So over to you, Alex. Thanks so much for being here.
Perfect. Thank you, Anna. Really excited to jump into this topic in a bit more detail. And thank you all of you for taking some time out of your day to be part of the discussion here. So as Anna already introduced, we'll be talking today a bit more about climate change and coastal hazards as they relate to the construction industry in Nova Scotia. And specifically, I thought there would be a few topics within this that would be worthwhile to go into in a bit more detail. First, we'll talk a bit about why should this industry consider climate change. From there, we'll talk through provide an overview of some of the climate hazards that are relevant to the construction industry here in the province of Nova Scotia. And from there, we'll talk a bit about some of the resources that might support adaptation. So the kinds of information, tools, training resources, things like that, that might support actually putting some of this information into practice and being more prepared, more resilient to the kinds of impacts that we're going to be talking about today. Now, when I say construction industry, I think it's useful to just delineate what exactly we mean by that in the purposes of the presentation today. So I like this image from the Nova Scotia Construction Sector Council, just to delineate the three main areas of construction activity here in the province. So that includes industrial activities, so factories, warehouses, distribution centers, industrial plants, all of those types of activities. Commercial, retail stores, office buildings, restaurants, hotels, all of that, and institutional, so government buildings, schools, hospital, religious institutions, all of those sort of large-scale endeavors are one facet of the construction industry here. There's another facet focused on residential or house building, so construction of single-family dwellings, duplexes for residential use. And the other major aspect of the sector is public infrastructure. So that includes the bridge building, the road building, pipeline construction, sewers, tunnels, water mains, all of those other pieces of infrastructure that really support the way our communities operate. And in addition to those three areas, I think it's useful to recognize the construction industry can include any portion of the life cycle here. So whether we're talking about design, the actual building or construction, as well as the maintenance pieces here. And also recognizing that beyond these direct spheres, there's a lot of direct and indirect influences with government, industry associations, suppliers, clients, and so on. So recognizing that everyone's personal interaction with this topic may extend beyond some of those pieces, but that's what I'm thinking of when I'm talking about the construction industry for the purposes of our webinar today. And the other piece of context I thought would be useful to start with right off the top here is what we are focusing on when we're thinking about impacts of climate change hazards, and addressing climate change. Because I'm sure many of you in the industry are familiar with a couple of different avenues here for action. And typically within climate action work, we break this down into mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation are all of those actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that cause climate change. So the sustainable transportation networks, working towards more clean energy systems, energy efficiency, and that sort of deep retrofit work in buildings, all of that typically falls under that mitigation sphere. That's all, of course, incredibly important, but that's not what we're focusing on today. We're really focusing on the impacts of the climate on the construction sector rather than the impacts of the construction sector on the climate. So really focusing a bit more on the adaptation side of things. So how do we manage the risks of climate change impacts? So whether that's thinking about emergency preparedness or business continuity, the types of infrastructure upgrades that might be needed and some of the planning that goes behind that, that's the area where we're focusing our discussion here. And of course, recognizing those two areas do interact in various ways, certainly not meaning to ignore that, but focusing more on that impacts and adaptation piece of the climate change spectrum. So with that context, let's jump into things here with that first section on why should we consider climate change in the construction sector. And there's a few pieces to this that I'll touch on in turn in sort of a brief way at the very least. Talk a bit about regulations, codes, and standards, and how the expectation to consider climate change is really becoming more of an actual expectation from that standpoint. Talk a bit about perceptions from the sector, and talk a bit about business implications as well, just to, again, set the scene for this from a few different avenues. And the first one there is that sort of regulatory codes and standards piece that I mentioned, using an example here of the National Building Code of Canada for 2025. Now, I know this isn't adopted provincially yet, but hopefully as we work in that direction, and folks may have already seen some of this, work has been done to update the 2025 National Building Code to use future climate data for the first time. It's a really exciting development. We're one of the first countries around the world who's made that step forward. And really what this looks like in practice is updated values to consider how building design is impacted by things like changes in heat, cold, wind, snow, and rainfall. And really, like I mentioned, this is a significant step towards ensuring that both new and retrofitted buildings remain safe, functional, and resilient throughout their service life. So recognizing that the conditions that buildings were designed for are often a bit more historical looking, but as we start to understand that the climate has already changed and will continue to, using this kinds of information can really help to inform what that looks like in the future. Sort of beyond the National Building Code, I can also mention that there is work in progress to incorporate similar climate-informed design values into the Canadian Highway Bridge Design Code, as well as the Canadian Electrical Code. So really at the national level, trying to provide a consistent foundation for building and infrastructure decisions. And I'll leave it sort of at that for the purposes of today. If you're interested in diving into this topic in a bit more detail, that is one of the focuses of the webinar that's happening next week. So we really would encourage you to hear directly from the folks that are involved in developing some of these codes and standards at the National Research Council and Canadian Standards Association about what that process looks like and what might be coming next. But for the purposes of today, one reason to consider climate change in the industry is it's becoming an expectation to do so. Another reason to consider climate change is that many of your peers in the industry are increasingly recognizing that it's important to do so. There has been some surveying done nationally over the last number of years. I pulled the results from one survey led by the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction a few years ago now. And from that work, they identified that about 80% of people working in the building sector believe that climate change should be used to inform their work. So overwhelming majority think that this is important, something they should be doing. And most of those people also believe they should not wait until climate change is incorporated into those official codes and standards that I was talking about to start doing that. So yes, National Building Code has just been updated. That will be hopefully adopted provincially at some point. There's other pieces in the pipeline, but many people don't feel like we need to wait for that to happen, for those legal requirements to be in place to start doing this. It's sort of beyond the survey piece here. I thought it would be useful to share one story as well. I didn't feel this was appropriate to capture on a slide, so bear with me as I recollect a little bit here. But at a workshop I was doing with a community a few years ago now, just a selection of community members talking about climate change in their community, what they were concerned about, what changes they'd like to see. One of the gentlemen there pulled me aside and mentioned that he was working in the construction sector and had recently been doing some work on coastal properties. And he was kind of talking me through this process of, he was showing up to the job sites and it was right along the coast. So there were days where the ocean had been really active overnight and like seaweed had even swept up onto the foundation and they were needing to start their day by clearing that off and pushing all that debris aside. And sharing as well that the family who was going to be living there would show up sometimes and the children were running around and playing and really excited about this future home that they were going to be living in and how beautiful the property was and everything there. But what he said that really stuck with me was really somber, really serious as he was kind of thinking this through and sharing, saying, I really hope I'm building this family a home and not a tomb. And that was a really striking way of saying that. It really just tell the deep like emotional resonance that was having for him as an individual, recognizing that at that very basic level, what we rely on buildings for is that place of safety, security from the elements around us, and really just that recognition that if we're not approaching these decisions carefully, there is the potential there for them not to meet that need and for potentially tragic consequences if we're really not careful. So just recognizing as well, that's an attitude from someone who was clearly sort of emotionally sorting through this as well. So beyond that sort of general perception of people thinking this is important, I've at least seen personal examples of people kind of struggling through the emotional side of this as well and what their role is in making these decisions for the future. Going back to that survey piece, just to go into this in a little bit more detail, one of the other interesting pieces that came out of that was looking at some of the specific building components, systems, materials, or products that were identified as being particularly vulnerable to climate change. And people within the industry recognized things like the building envelope, site drainage, so those issues with water and things related to heating, cooling, ventilation as being really highly vulnerable components and things that they were in particular quite concerned about, but also naming utility functions, the structure of the building itself, specific materials that are being used, hazard-specific issues like flooding and wildfires, things like that. So these are clearly issues that are already on the mind of people working in the sector. And I think that's useful to recognize here as well. And just to go a little bit deeper on that point, I know this figure is likely small. The point is not to go through this in detail. Just wanted to show this as one example of how another association is looking at this. This is from some work out of British Columbia, looking at how climate change affects building systems. And what it's trying to show here is what's changing in the climate, what that relates to as in terms of a hazard, and what types of building system vulnerabilities that might relate to. So just to talk through sort of one set of lines in a diagram like this, we can see, for example, increased summer temperatures is a stress that we can expect in the climate, and we'll talk about some of the local examples for that shortly. We know that that might result in a hazard result in weather conditions like hotter summers, and that might relate to a hazard for buildings like overheating. If a building is experiencing overheating, that can have implications for its cooling system. That can also potentially have implications for its power system and looking at the grid as a whole, so more of an indirect connection. But as temperatures rise, power consumption tends to increase as well. That can lead to brownouts and power outages. And recognizing as well, if that's the case, that power outage in the building has implications for heating systems, cooling systems, ventilation, lighting, telecom, fire and safety systems, things like that, right? So that's just sort of one set of lines through a diagram like this, but that was an interesting approach just to look at some of those direct and indirect effects for buildings. There are other frameworks as well out there that we could think of in terms of how climate might interact with building systems, thinking about the support function that buildings are intended to provide, just in very technical terms. Can it withstand structural loads, such as wind pressure, weight, snow loads, all of that? There's the control function that buildings are intended to provide, that safe, comfortable space, controlling the flow of heat, sound, moisture, air, all of those functions. There's a distribution function that buildings play in terms of how do we distribute heat and fresh air through HVAC systems, electricity, telecom, all of those important considerations. And finally, even the finish functions. So are there durable, aesthetically pleasing surfaces on the walls and otherwise in buildings? And that can have interactions with climate as well. So again, there's a whole lot of different direct and indirect connections to various aspects of the industry that I think are useful to be aware of and hopefully touch on all of your work in various different ways. And the last consideration I thought would be useful to cover just from a why should we care about this perspective is impact on business operations as well. Again, a lot of construction sector operations are private sector businesses. There is a profit margin to maintain at the end of the day, people to keep employed, all of that. There's been some interesting work done, again, at the national level through Building Development Canada. So this isn't necessarily construction sector specific, but I think many small and medium enterprises are related to that industry. So I thought this would be useful. And they break things down in terms of the impacts on businesses for direct risks and indirect risks. On the direct side of things here, it's the direct risks to facilities, as well as equipment and things like that. So climate conditions, extreme heat, flooding, wildfire, all of that being potentially damaging for the places and the types of equipment that people are working with. Direct risks to supply chains as well. And I've certainly heard, at least anecdotally, that this is happening a lot more. In terms of, if there's an extreme weather event, sometimes transportation routes can be cut off, and that relates to sort of the shipping distribution piece here mentioned as well. Just the ability to source and effectively procure and move materials around is certainly impacted by the changing climate. Even things as simple as if you are someone who procures wood, for example, the types of trees that are growing and thriving in this province are changing as the climate changes, and there's some impacts for the industry even on that level. And certainly direct risks to employee health and well-being as well. When we talk about those heat waves, those flooding events, wildfire smoke, whatever that looks like, there are numerous instances where the people doing this work, often working outdoors or in at least not quite climate-controlled environments, a lot of potential there to be exposed to potentially hazardous conditions. So how do we keep the people doing this work safe as well? And then on the indirect side, just to touch on this briefly, everything from changes in global trade patterns, the shipping and distribution pieces there that I mentioned, as well as that ability to access raw materials. Again, these are all things that are being impacted by climate change in their own way and may or may not be sort of directly linked to the types of operations, the types of work that your organizations are involved in. So all of those things combined from a business lens, if we're not being prepared for them, can lead to things like reduced revenue, reduced productivity, increased operating costs, increased capital expenditures, or increased insurance costs. So again, just from a purely financial bottom line perspective, useful to be aware of how the climate is changing and start to put some plans in place to consider what we do about that. So that's a few thoughts on why considering climate change might be important for the sector. Those regulatory requirements, those attitudes and perceptions, and the impacts on businesses. And again, that's not a comprehensive list. I'm sure that we could put our heads together and come up with some other reasons, but hopefully that's a helpful way to situate this issue a bit more broadly. And from here, I'd like to take a step into the second section for today and talk about what climate change looks like here in Nova Scotia. The focus is going to be on some of the general trends of what we're seeing here in this province. I will say right off the bat, if you find this kind of information useful for your work, would really encourage you to join the final webinar of this series, which is happening in 2 weeks, where the focus will be on future building design values and other very practical climate data tools that are intended a bit more specifically to be used for building design purposes. For today, really just focusing a little bit more high level on what's changing. So getting into that topic, I think we'll situate ourselves first with just a bit about where this data is coming from and where we are in the present. And I think one thing to be very clear on differentiating is weather versus climate. I'm sure you're all very familiar with the idea of weather and how it relates to your operations. We know that this reflects the short-term changes in the atmosphere from day to day, week to week, from year to year. Sometimes it's hotter or colder or wetter or drier, and those conditions have implications for our work. We also know from a lot of our experience, particularly here on the rather chaotic East Coast, that even if we're trying to look 10 days, 2 weeks out, that weather forecast can be changeable, let's say. We don't necessarily, we might have a sense of what types of weather are on the horizon, but knowing exactly what's going to happen, where and when is chaotic, really difficult to predict. So that's sort of the reality for the weather side of things. Most of the information I'm going to be talking to you about today is climate data. So really the distinction there is looking at patterns and averages of weather over longer periods of time. So typically I'm looking at least 30 years worth of information that I'm averaging together, just because statistically that's enough information to help us understand the typical range of weather patterns that we might see. So in this case, we're less concerned about exactly what's happening when, but we know the types of weather that are typically consistent in a certain area and how those averages are changing over time. And one analogy shown in the middle of the screen here that I find is somewhat helpful for this distinction, if this is a new concept for you, is that of a person walking their dog. I don't know if you have walked a dog before, but if it's anything like mine, it's certainly not going anywhere in a straight line. It's often darting back and forth across the path very chaotically, to the point if I asked you to predict where exactly is that dog going to be at some point in the future, that's difficult to do. The dog is our weather in this analogy. However, if we looked at the path of the person walking the dog, our climate in this analogy, they're often taking a much straighter, more predictable course, and the weather or the dog is sort of varying around their path with some level of predictability. So we might not be able to pinpoint exactly the weather that we're going to see at a certain day or a certain year in the future, but we can understand the path that the climate is taking and understand the weather will fluctuate around that to some extent. So hopefully that's a useful analogy just to keep in mind as we move forward with some of this data. And we'll put that into practice right away with just a quick look at some historical observations, just to situate us in what has already changed. What I'm showing on the slide here, and I know this is a small legend, the specifics aren't particularly important, but this is showing annual average temperature over the last 110 years or so for Kentville. Just Kentville has a nice long record. We see similar patterns at other weather stations around the province as well. And a couple of things to point out in a graph like this. One, again, we can see those fluctuations from year to year. Sometimes it's hotter, sometimes it's colder. We could see similar things if we looked at precipitation as an example. And that's, again, our weather and our climate, our person and our dog. Conditions aren't always the same year to year. That's normal enough. What isn't typical for conditions in the absence of climate change would be that increasing trend, sort of that dash red line that I've included through that data. So you can see a very clear increasing trend over time to the point where the kinds of sort of the average temperature for a year in recent years would be sort of typical of quite a hot year if we're looking 100 years ago. The kinds of cold years that we're getting now are typical of kind of an average year, 80 to 100 years ago, that sort of thing. Temperatures have already increased by around a degree to a degree and a half, depending on the data record that we're looking at. And I think that's useful to keep in mind. So I'm sure many of you have noticed changes in your own lives, in the seasons around us and the timing of things there, the patterns of plants and animals around us, the types of extreme weather events that we've been seeing in recent years. And again, just making the connection that all of those changes are with just over a degree of increase in our average temperature. So as we start to look further ahead to 2, 3, potentially 4 or 5 degrees of increase in our average temperature as we move forward through time, just recognizing how much more change is associated with that. But moving right along, last piece of context before we get to the local information here is just briefly touching on where this is coming from. Again, of course, we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know exactly what's going to happen as we look into the future. So the information I'm talking to you about today is coming from climate models that are complex computer models that help us understand some of those long-term patterns that I was talking about. Of course, acknowledging as well that a lot of what happens in the future is driven by decisions that people around the world make today and in the years to come. So there is certainly uncertainty depending on what future trajectory we might take. For example, a higher scenario shown in red there or a more moderate scenario shown in green there. So some of the data I'll be talking to you about is sort of from the solid lines of both the red and the green, just to show you a bit of the variation of what we could expect. Because even in that more moderate, more optimistic scenario, we can see that conditions in the future are already different and will continue to be quite a bit different than they were in the past. That has implications for a lot of our built systems and natural systems that were designed for that range of historical climate conditions that we're departing from. So with that context, let's talk about what's happening here in Nova Scotia. I've got 6 trends that I thought might be useful to take a slide on each that have some relevant implications for the construction sector specifically. So we'll talk about hotter summers, milder winters, drought and wildfire conditions, changing precipitation patterns, stronger storms, and some of the coastal flooding that we're seeing on the coast. And we'll start with looking at the hotter summers piece here. And maybe just to briefly describe the table, I'm showing a few different variables related to rising temperatures. I'll touch on those as we go. But wanting to be very clear that in the table here, I'm showing data across 4 different periods of time from the recent past, so what conditions used to look like, through to the present, so reflecting sort of where we are now from some of that climate model data, towards the middle of the century, and then towards the end of the century. Again, all for average 30-year periods. I'll also point out that the data I pulled for today is specific to Halifax, just that's where I'm located today, so that made sense to me. We see pretty consistent trends across the province, but if you're located in Amherst or in Yarmouth or in Sydney, the actual numbers might be a little different. Very happy to help connect you with the data for your location or wherever it is that you're working, if that's of interest as well. But for the purposes of today, just picking one location to show the trends here. And going back to this hotter summers piece, there's a few things that we can see here, both related to the hottest day that we might see. So the hottest that air temperatures get, this is as high as the temperature goes on the thermometer, not even accounting for the humidity piece. Historically, here in Halifax, that would be just over 30 degrees would be our typical hottest day. The period that we're in now, we're already starting to see that, 31.5 degrees is sort of our new typical hottest day. And as we get towards the middle of the century, those 32, 33 degree temperatures are going to become more common, potentially start to see those every year, things like that. We could also think about this in terms of the number of very hot days that we get. So 29 degrees Celsius is usually where we issue a heat warning here in Nova Scotia. That's the number I'm showing here in the table. So historically, we'd only see about 2 of those days per year on average, already closer to 5, getting towards maybe 2 weeks by the middle of the century, potentially up to a month, month and a half towards the end of the century, again, depending on under that higher scenario that I briefly alluded to there. And with the very warm nights here, again, just showing that it's not just the high heat during the day, but also the lack of relief overnight. So some pretty clear trends here related to temperatures being hotter in Nova Scotia than they used to be historically. From a construction sector perspective, there's a few implications here. We can certainly think about worker health and safety from the heat stress, dehydration, fatigue angle here. Increased risk of accidents when those kind of conditions are in place, the potential for reduced productivity, just with that necessity to slow down the pace of work, more frequent breaks during the summer. Those things are all really important in terms of keeping people safe. There's also a material degradation piece to this as well. We know that materials like concrete or asphalts can become harder to work with or have reduced effectiveness as temperatures go beyond certain thresholds. Even certain adhesives or paints don't necessarily behave in quite the same way, and it can again become more challenging to work with. Equipment can also face some challenges if we're thinking about engines in heavy machinery or vehicles, even certain tools that might be at increased risk of overheating, thinking about, does that slow down work? Does that increase costs? All of that. And certainly thinking about increased cooling demand in buildings as well with those higher temperatures. Second trend I wanted to touch on was milder winters. So again, we can see some very clear trends here in the coldest day of the year, getting quite a bit warmer through time. Winters are warming most rapidly out of all of our seasons. The numbers of days where we're seeing frost or ice days, which are days where the temperature is staying below 0 for the entire day. So where we're seeing ice persist, for example, really dramatic decreases there, quite substantial. Our winters will feel quite substantially different. And that's something I've anecdotally heard from many people about the first thing that they've noticed about climate change. The winters don't feel the same as they used to. And also included some freeze thaw data here as well, just to show that trend. Seeing a decrease in the overall number of freeze thaw cycles over time, but also a bit of a shift here where we're seeing less freeze thaw during the shoulder season, so spring and fall, with more freeze thaw taking place during that winter season itself. So again, from a construction perspective, we can see implications here of ground being potentially muddy rather than frozen. And that can impact site access or create different logistical challenges that way. Some of that freeze thaw heaving can also create challenges for grading or foundations and that sort of work that's happening at that time of the year. Other than that, in general, there are some potential productivity benefits to milder winters from a construction sector perspective. If we're thinking about fewer disruptions due to extreme cold or heavy snow, though again, balancing that with the increase in disruptions during the summer, as I was just referring to, and some potential material performance implications here as well. Again, temperatures below freezing can be challenging for certain types of liquids that folks are trying to work with. And certainly some decreased heating demand in buildings during the winter season itself as well. Though again, we don't want to under-design our heating systems for the future, recognizing that we're still in a present period of time where heating demand is still quite important. Third trend was around drought and wildfire. And really on the slide here, just showing the increase in fire season length with those warmer conditions I was talking about, as well as the increase in the number of high danger days that we might see in our climate in our region. And again, from a construction perspective, droughts and wildfires could relate to water shortages for certain processes, whether that's concrete mixing, site cleaning, dust control purposes, things like that. We know that dry or hard soil can be more challenging for excavation. There can be some soil compaction challenges when water is really scarce that can cause foundation cracking in certain situations. Really wanted to touch here on the health piece of this as well, which sometimes goes underappreciated, thinking about the air quality impacts for outdoor workers specifically. Folks may have seen this in the news over the summer, but with the Long Lake wildfire that we had in Annapolis County this past summer, there were 26 consecutive days that had an air quality warning or advisory. So 26 days in a row where there was official guidance that it was unhealthy to some level to be breathing the air, particularly for anyone who's a bit more sensitive to it. So thinking about the implications of that from a health perspective is really important, even if there isn't a fire, directly on site. We've certainly seen many examples of wildfire smoke plumes impacting our province in various ways, and really just all the emergency preparedness pieces that go into some of those wildfire pieces as well. And then changing precipitation patterns here, really focusing on the flooding aspect to this, increases in the types of really intense rainfall that we're getting, both in terms of the amounts as well as the number of days where those intense rainfall conditions might be happening. And of course, that poses implications for direct damages from flooding to the structures of buildings and infrastructure. Also know that flooding puts people in danger. It can cause access challenges for emergency services. And again, just from a materials management perspective, if we're not being careful about storing certain toxic materials when there are flooding risks, there's risks of environmental contamination and a lot of sort of ramifications related to that as well. The fifth of six trends that I wanted to touch on was stronger storms. So really the tropical storm, hurricane type events in this case. And this increase in strength is really driven by warming oceans in the Atlantic basin that enable these tropical storm systems to travel a lot further north before weakening. It's exactly the kind of conditions we saw with Hurricane Fiona a few years ago now, where the sea surface temperatures along its track north were several degrees higher than they would usually be at that time of year. And that's probably the main reason that storm broke records in our region for low pressure and storm surge amounts and just some of the high winds and rainfall rates and things like that associated with that system. I'm sure many people remember the extended power outages that come along with that event in particular and other storms like it. That certainly has operational implications. We know that strong storm events often bring really high rainfall rates, those higher peak wind speeds that I mentioned. So again, trees coming down, power lines coming down, materials potentially being blown around if they're not properly secured. And for anyone working near the coast as well, those really strong storm surges during these intense events can accelerate rates of erosion as well. So keeping that in mind, again, we have a very diverse coastline. So the bedrock situation isn't necessarily changing a whole lot, but any kind of more loose sediment, sandy coastlines, things like that can change really dramatically. I think there were instances of 20 or 30 meters being lost overnight during Hurricane Fiona on some of those more vulnerable coastlines. And then the last trend that I wanted to mention was around coastal flooding. Folks might be aware of the coastal hazard map. I'm showing a screenshot of it here on the slide. This is available for all marine coasts across the province. So just showing some of the data here again for the Halifax area. We can see the values for high tide, storm surge, and sea level rise leading to a total projected flood elevation. And on the image there, the green color is relating to the present day risk. So just if a storm were to hit at high tide, what types of areas would be at risk there? And the more pinky purpley layer is that same situation of a storm surge at high tide, but adding sea level rise onto it towards 2100. So again, we can see this is just at the on the sort of Dartmouth side of the Halifax Harbor. Certainly areas here where there are properties or access routes that are being impacted by coastal flooding or risk of being impacted by coastal flooding. That's really important to be aware of and design around. Sort of beyond the immediate flooding piece as well, I think it's always useful to acknowledge the potential for saltwater intrusion. So anywhere near the coast, if you're installing wells, septic system, any kind of underground infrastructure that can corrode, there's a potential there for increased saltiness in that subsurface layer that can certainly cause implications for a variety of subsurface infrastructure. So one more piece to this I just wanted to highlight is folks may be familiar with this idea of building climate zones. So as I was walking through all of that data there, you may be wondering how much of an implication that actually has for how buildings are typically designed. And building climate zones is one data set that sort of outlines this. And again, maybe this will be touched on a little bit more at the webinar in a couple of weeks, but just at a very high level here, we can see that for the historical conditions, so if you look at that average 30-year period, 1980 to 2010, most of Nova Scotia would be classified as being in Zone 6, with parts of the southern part of the province there being in Zone 5. So that would sort of dictate the types of heating standards typically that would be expected for building a building in that area. As we move towards the middle of the century, so that 2021 to 2050 period, pretty much the entire province is now in that Zone 5 area. And towards the end of the century, under that higher scenario, substantial portion of the province moves into that Zone 4 territory. So that's kind of like Southern Ontario currently, for example. So there is an actual shift here in terms of the types of design values that are being used. And last concept I wanted to briefly touch on here was that of climate risk, because I hope that was useful just to walk through some of the climate information, some of the trends and kind of what's happening here in the province of Nova Scotia. But really all of that relates to the climate hazard portion of this sort of framework. It's what's changing. We certainly know that whether we're thinking about individuals or communities or infrastructure, anything like that, there are other elements that impact the actual risks that we're experiencing. Exposure is certainly one of those. So not only is something changing, but is there something that we care about that could be affected by it? Are there people? Are there infrastructure assets in flood hazard zones? Are there people working outdoors? People exposed to wildfire smoke, all of those things. There's an exposure element to climate risk. And vulnerability as well, we sometimes even break down further into sensitivity and adaptive capacity. So when I say sensitivity, I mean the degree to which something is affected by a change. So again, we talked about, outdoor workers are more exposed to extreme heat as an example, but we know even within that population, there are certain individuals that will be at higher medical risk for their own sort of health reasons to those higher heat conditions and things like that. So again, we could think about this for individuals, buildings, materials, all of that as well. But there's certainly a sensitivity piece to this, and capacity as well. So that's the ability that we have in terms of skills, information, or money, or other kinds of resources to manage those changing conditions. And the reason I think it's useful to break that down is those are also our levers for taking action. So we can't necessarily change the types of hazards that we're going to experience here in the province, but we do have opportunities to potentially adjust the exposure of the people and assets that we care about to those hazards. We have abilities to account for the sensitivity of the materials that we're using, the people that we're involving in this work, and we certainly have opportunities to build our capacity to deal with these changing conditions. So I wanted to introduce that idea. And the last thing I wanted to touch on today is just to rather briefly introduce a variety of resources that might be helpful for actually putting some of this into practice. This will be a relatively brief overview because there's a lot of information, tools, and supports that are out there that might be used to inform different types of work. So consider this a bit of a taster for the types of things that we might be able to support you with, or others might be able to. Very happy to talk about these in more detail or to follow up afterwards if anyone has specific questions about some of these pieces. But in general, just wanted to set the context here as well about what does designing for the climate mean? As we talked about a bit earlier, building and infrastructure design is typically based on historical climate. And as we've hopefully shown through the course of today, that's no longer adequate, no longer sufficient for the future. So from a very practical side of things here, we need to be thinking about increased cooling and ventilation requirements, shifts in heating demand, changes to rain and snowfall loads, indoor air quality management, all of those different things. So what might help with this? First of all, I wanted to touch on some of the resources from Climate Atlantic that may be of interest, starting with us as people. We have a help desk, which includes myself and many of our other staff team across the region. If anything I've talked about today is of interest and you'd like to chat about it more, please do reach out. We're here to provide one-on-one support or anything like that to help you put this into practice. So that is always an open offer. Beyond that, we can assist with anything related to climate data and adaptation services, offer a variety of different tools on our websites, offer different training programs, formal and informal, and have a variety of infographics and reports available as well. Showing one example here on the screen, just of a one-page infographic looking at climate impacts on buildings, what those impacts are, some very high-level thoughts about adaptation approaches and things like that. So sometimes if you're talking about this for the first time with someone who's trying to wrap their head around it, that kind of resource can be a useful starting point. Wanted to highlight one of our tools in particular, just given the focus on some coastal construction pieces, as we've talked about a bit today, that being our coastal adaptation toolkit. Very briefly, this is an online decision tree tool that evaluates the fit of different adaptation options for specific coastal properties. So by answering a series of questions on your own end about the types of coastal materials and the types of flooding or erosion risks that that property might be exposed to, can help to identify the types of interventions from an engineering perspective that might be most effective for that type of coastal environment. Really useful tool. And again, our staff is available to help walk you through that and use that appropriately. A lot of other national resources becoming available as well. Folks might be familiar with the Climate Insights platform that was developed through Housing Infrastructure and Communities Canada. It was launched in 2024, and really the goal is to support infrastructure practitioners in making climate-informed decisions. So they have a whole variety of resources, tools, information, and case studies, whole variety of strategies that you can browse here. So I'm just showing one example of a screenshot from the website where I've selected, I'm interested in adaptation to extreme heat for buildings. And it spit out 38 different options for me to consider there. It has a whole lot of details on descriptions, how they work, considerations, all the co-benefits and trade-offs, and a lot of just guidance on how to put something like that into practice. So again, a lot of that work has been done to help you take a step forward in understanding what your options are and how to pursue them. From the province of Nova Scotia, there are a wide variety of resources related to the coastal environment that might be helpful. I already mentioned that coastal hazard map that shows that flooding extent. The other functionality there is anyone in Nova Scotia can request a free coastal hazard assessment report for any property in Nova Scotia. That will include not only a bit more of a breakdown about the flooding pieces that you can find yourself on that map, but also include a bit of a high-level erosion assessment as well. So that can be a really useful tool, just if you have questions about a specific property and what its exposure to different coastal flooding and erosion concerns might be. There are also guides on safeguarding your coastal property, which is really intended to help promote healthy coastlines in the face of a changing climate. We do often hear erosion, for example, talked about in a negative context, about it's something that's happening that we have to protect against or avoid or manage, but really it's part of a natural coastal process. So trying to really shift that mindset around how do we understand coastal dynamics and plan around that appropriately. It's also a guide around nature-based solutions, so thinking about how to restore, enhance, or mimic different natural processes to work with the coast a little bit more for, again, those flooding and erosion concerns. Really great guide there. Something a little bit more real estate, but again, from a construction perspective, there might be some interest in checking out that checklist for buying a coastal home in Nova Scotia. A whole variety of considerations there on thinking just about where things are sited and what types of considerations might be interesting to think through there. And again, maybe less directly relevant, but on the sort of planning side of things, there's also some guidance for municipalities on development of land use bylaws and regulations. So again, from a construction perspective, it might be helpful just to have some insight into how municipalities and other regulatory agencies are using this type of information to make those decisions and why that's so important. And beyond that, there's a whole lot more too. I won't even go into these in any detail, but to say the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation has a whole variety of great infographics and guides and training resources and things like that. There are credentials and best practice guides from different professional associations, different protocols that might be used to help guide decisions. A whole lot of great resources that are out there. You're certainly not the ones thinking about this for the first time. There has been a lot of thought put into sort of the engineering and planning aspects of this sector, and a lot of resources that we can help connect you with if that's of interest. And maybe the last thing I wanted to say is relating back to some of that Business Development Canada work that I referenced earlier. Some of their advice is hopefully aligns with what we've covered today. The first tip was to learn what to expect in your geographic region in terms of preparing for climate risk. So hopefully I've been able to help fill that gap for you a bit today, give you a good sense of what's happening here in Nova Scotia. That ability to be prepared for various types of climate risks. So again, hopefully that's a very brief list of resources has at least led to some inspiration on what's out there, some different tools and resources that might be able to tap into, and really just thinking about how to protect what it is that you do, your role in the sector, who you need to collaborate with, all of that to approach this in a well-informed way. I want to leave a bit of time for questions, so I think I'll just wrap up there. My contact information is on screen, also very easy to find through the Climate Atlantic website. I'm sure we can drop my email into the chat there as well.